On the morning of January 28, 1975, a bitter cold settled over the quiet streets of Teaneck, New Jersey. Inside 254 Essex Street, a sprawling mansion that seemed too grand for the suburban neighborhood, federal agents moved through rooms with mechanical precision. They tore through closets. They searched behind paintings. They climbed into the attic. And there, hidden in the shadows of American prosperity, they found $584,000 in cash, small bills, crumpled, stacked. The currency of an empire built on powder and pain. The mansion belonged to Frank Lucas, a man whose name would become synonymous with the darkness that consumed Harlem in the 1970s. But on that frozen January morning, as agents carried boxes of evidence through his front door, Frank Lucas was already in custody. His palace was falling. His kingdom was crumbling. And the story of how a sharecropper's son from North Carolina became the most powerful drug dealer in New York City was about to become legend. But before the millions, before the mansion, before the blue magic that would flow through Harlem's veins like a toxic river, there was only poverty. There was only LaGrange, North Carolina. There was only a boy named Frank, born on September 9, 1930, into a world that offered him nothing but the certainty of dirt under his fingernails and the promise that he would die exactly as poor as he was born. Frank Lucas grew up in a shack. Not a house. A shack. The distinction matters. Houses have foundations. Houses have futures. Shacks have neither. His family worked land they didn't own, picking crops they couldn't afford to eat, living in a system designed to keep them exactly where they were. His father, a man broken by the mathematics of sharecropping, understood the equation perfectly. Work equaled debt. Debt equaled bondage. Bondage equaled death. This was the inheritance passed down to Frank Lucas. This was the legacy he was meant to accept. But Frank Lucas did not accept it. When he was 6 years old, he witnessed something that would calcify inside him, hardening into a philosophy that would guide every decision he made for the next 4 decades. He watched as members of the Ku Klux Klan murdered his cousin. They killed him for looking at a white woman. Not touching. Not speaking to. Looking. The boy's crime was his eyes. His punishment was death. And young Frank Lucas, hiding in the shadows, watching the violence unfold, learned a lesson that the American education system would never teach him. He learned that the rules were written by those with power. He learned that morality was a luxury afforded only to those who could survive without it. He learned that in America, you were either the boot or the neck beneath it. By the time Frank Lucas was a teenager, LaGrange had become too small to contain the rage growing inside him. In 1946, at the age of 15, he left North Carolina with less than nothing. He traveled north, following the same routes that millions of Black Americans had taken during the Great Migration, searching for something that resembled opportunity in the industrial cities of the North. He arrived in Harlem with $7 in his pocket and a suitcase that contained everything he owned. The weight of it was nothing. The weight of what he carried inside was immeasurable. Harlem in the late 1940s was a paradox. It was the cultural capital of Black America, home to the music, the art, the literature that defined an entire generation. But it was also a ghetto, systematically segregated, deliberately impoverished, and controlled by forces that extracted wealth without ever investing in the community. The Italian Mafia controlled the heroin trade. They controlled the numbers rackets. They controlled the protection schemes. And they did so with the implicit permission of a police force that turned blind eyes in exchange for envelopes stuffed with cash. For a young man like Frank Lucas, newly arrived and desperately poor, Harlem offered 2 paths. Work for wages that would keep you poor forever, or work for criminals who might kill you, but at least offered the possibility of escape. Frank Lucas chose the latter. He began as a driver, a runner, a nobody in the criminal ecosystem that operated in the shadows of Harlem's streets. But he was watching, always watching. He studied the hierarchy. He learned the rotes. He memorized the faces of men who held power and the weaknesses that would eventually destroy them. And then, in the early 1950s, he met the man who would change everything. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but everyone called him Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was a legend. He was the Black Godfather of Harlem, a man who had fought the Italian Mafia to a standstill and carved out a territory that he controlled with intelligence, brutality, and a code of ethics that was brutal but consistent. He never sold drugs to children. He never allowed his dealers to sample their own product. And he never forgot where he came from. Bumpy Johnson saw something in Frank Lucas. Maybe he saw himself, decades younger, hungry and ruthless, and willing to do whatever was necessary to survive. Maybe he saw a son, an heir, someone who could carry forward the empire he had built. Whatever he saw, he took Frank Lucas under his wing. For 15 years, Frank Lucas served as Bumpy Johnson's driver, his bodyguard, his confidant, and his student. He learned how to move through the underworld without leaving fingerprints. He learned how to negotiate with men who respected only violence. He learned how to read a room, to sense when a deal was about to go wrong, to understand that in the criminal world, paranoia was not a weakness but a survival skill. And most importantly, he learned the economics of the drug trade. He learned that the Italian Mafia was taking a cut at every level of the supply chain, that by the time heroin reached Harlem's streets, it had been cut so many times that its purity was less than 5%, and that the real money was not in selling drugs, but in controlling the source. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson collapsed in Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He died of a heart attack, surrounded by friends, still free, still powerful, still a king and a kingdom that existed in the margins of American society. Frank Lucas stood at his funeral and looked at the crowd that had gathered to mourn the man who had been his mentor, his protector, and the closest thing to family he had ever known. And he made a decision. He would not simply inherit Bumpy Johnson's empire. He would surpass it. The problem was clear. The Italian Mafia controlled the heroin supply. They bought from French suppliers, who bought from Turkish farmers, who cultivated the poppies that became the powder that destroyed lives. At each level, someone took a cut. By the time the heroin reached Harlem, the price had been multiplied by factors of 10, 20, sometimes 50. The dealers couldn't afford to sell pure product and make a profit, so they cut it with quinine, with baby powder, with anything white that would stretch the supply. The addicts got weaker product, the dealers made less money, and the Italian Mafia grew rich off the inefficiency of a system they controlled. Frank Lucas looked at this system and asked a simple question. What if we cut out the middlemen? In 1968, Frank Lucas did something that no black drug dealer had ever done before. He left the United States and traveled to Bangkok, Thailand. From there, he made his way into the Golden Triangle, the region where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar converged, where the opium poppies grew in fields that stretched to the horizon, where the farmers who cultivated them lived in poverty, while American soldiers fought and died in a war that was consuming the region. Frank Lucas met with suppliers directly. No Italian middlemen, no French connection, just him, his money, and his audacity. He negotiated prices that were a fraction of what dealers in New York were paying. And then he solved the final problem. How to get pure heroin from Southeast Asia to the streets of Harlem without it being intercepted, cut, or stolen. This is where the legend becomes murky, where fact and mythology blend into something that might be true, might be exaggerated, and might be the kind of story that becomes more important than the truth. According to Frank Lucas, he smuggled heroin into the United States by hiding it in the coffins of dead American servicemen returning from Vietnam. He claimed to have contacts in the military, men who were willing to help for the right price, men who understood that the bodies of soldiers killed in action were treated with reverence and were rarely, if ever, searched by customs officials. He claimed that he would seal the heroin in double layers of cellophane, place it inside the coffins alongside the corpses, and watch as the dead became unwitting mules in a supply chain that fed addiction back home. The claim was never fully proven. Investigators disputed it. Some said it was impossible, that the logistics didn't work, that Lucas was embellishing his own mythology. But whether it was true or not, the heroin arrived. Pure. Uncut. 98%. Frank Lucas branded it Blue Magic, stamped it with a logo, and flooded Harlem with a product that was twice as strong as anything else on the market. Addicts who were used to 5% purity were suddenly injecting product that was 20 times more potent. Overdoses spiked, emergency rooms filled, and Frank Lucas became the most powerful drug dealer in New York City. The money came in waves, not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions. At the peak of his operation, Frank Lucas was grossing $1 million per day. Not per week, not per month, per day. The cash was so voluminous that it became a logistical problem. He couldn't deposit it in banks without triggering suspicion. He couldn't spend it fast enough to keep up with the flow, so he hid it. In attics, in closets, in walls, in safe deposit boxes scattered across the city. And he bought the trappings of wealth that signaled to everyone who saw him that Frank Lucas was no longer a sharecropper's son from North Carolina. He was royalty. In 1970, Frank Lucas purchased the mansion at 254 Essex Street in Teaneck, New Jersey. The house was a monument to his success, a sprawling property with manicured lawns and rooms filled with furniture that cost more than most families earned in a year. It was not the flashiest mansion in America. It was not a palace in the Hollywood sense. But for a man who had grown up in a shack, who had picked crops for pennies, who had arrived in Harlem with $7, the mansion represented something more valuable than luxury. It represented escape. It represented proof that he had beaten a system designed to crush him. It represented a future where his children would never know the poverty that had defined his childhood. But even as Frank Lucas moved into his mansion, even as he counted his millions, even as he built an organization that employed hundreds of people, he was making a mistake. He was becoming visible. The drug trade operates in shadows. It thrives on anonymity. The most successful criminals are the ones whose names you never learn, whose faces you never see, who move through society like ghosts, accumulating wealth without attracting attention. Frank Lucas understood this intellectually. Bumpy Johnson had taught him the value of discretion. But Frank Lucas was also human, and humans crave recognition. They crave respect. They crave the moment when people who once looked through them are forced to acknowledge their existence. On March 8, 1971, Frank Lucas attended the fight of the century, Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden. It was the most anticipated sporting event of the decade, a battle between two undefeated heavyweight champions, a cultural moment that transcended boxing. Celebrities filled the seats, politicians, actors, musicians, power brokers. and Frank Lucas walked to his ringside seat wearing a chinchilla coat that cost $100,000. The coat was magnificent. It was floor-length, rich brown, impossibly soft. It caught the light. It caught the cameras. It caught the attention of everyone in Madison Square Garden, including a detective named Richie Roberts. Richie Roberts was an anomaly in the New York Police Department. He was honest, genuinely honest, not in the performative way that corrupt cops pretend to be honest, but in the deeply inconvenient way that made him distrusted by his fellow officers. Years earlier, Roberts and his partner had discovered nearly $1 million in unmarked bills during a raid. They turned in every penny. No one believed them. Their fellow officers assumed they had skimmed off the top. The department launched an investigation into them, not the criminals. Roberts became a pariah, a man whose integrity made him more enemies than friends. But Roberts was also brilliant. He understood that the drug trade was changing, that a new generation of dealers was bypassing the Italian Mafia, that the power structure was shifting. And when he saw Frank Lucas at the fight of the century, wearing a coat that cost more than most cops earned in 2 years, sitting in seats that politicians couldn't afford, he asked a simple question. Who is that man? The investigation that followed would take years. Roberts assembled a team. They surveilled Lucas. They tracked his movements. They followed the money, or tried to, through a labyrinth of cash transactions that left no paper trail. They identified his network, a group Lucas called the Country Boys, men he had recruited from North Carolina, men he could trust because they shared his background, his poverty, his understanding that this was not just business, but survival. The Country Boys avoided the flashiness that defined Italian mob operations. They didn't hang out in social clubs. They didn't wear gold chains. They moved product efficiently, quietly, creating a distribution network that stretched from Harlem to New Jersey to cities across the East Coast. But efficiency was not the same as invisibility. And by 1974, Richie Roberts and his team had built a case. They had wiretaps. They had informants. They had surveillance photos that documented Lucas's empire. And on January 28, 1975, they moved. The raid on 254 Essex Street was not subtle. Federal agents surrounded the mansion in the pre-dawn hours. They broke through the front door with a battering ram. They moved through the house, room by room, documenting everything. In the attic, they found cash hidden in boxes. In the closets, they found more cash stuffed into bags. In total, they recovered $584,000 from the mansion alone. But the real value was not the cash. It was the documentation, ledgers, phone numbers, names, the architecture of an empire written in pencil on paper that Frank Lucas had been too confident to destroy. Frank Lucas was arrested along with several members of his family, his wife, his brothers, people who had believed in the dream he sold them, that wealth could insulate them from the violence of the world, that money could buy safety. They were all wrong. The trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors presented evidence of a heroin operation that had imported hundreds of kilograms of pure heroin into the United States. They presented testimony from addicts whose lives had been destroyed by blue magic. They presented financial records that showed the staggering scale of Lucas's wealth. And in 1976, Frank Lucas was convicted. The judge sentenced him to 70 years in federal prison. 70 years. Frank Lucas was 45 years old. A 70-year sentence was a life sentence. It was a death sentence. It was the system telling him that he would die in a cage, that the mansion was gone, that the empire was finished, that the boy from Lagrange had reached too far and would now pay the price. But Frank Lucas was not finished. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life and destroy whatever remained of his reputation in the criminal underworld. He became an informant. The decision was pragmatic. Frank Lucas understood mathematics. 70 years meant he would never breathe free air again. Cooperation meant a reduced sentence. It meant the possibility of seeing his children grow up. It meant survival. But in the world he came from, informants were the lowest form of life. They were rats. They were traitors. They were men who valued their own lives more than the code that held the criminal world together. By choosing to cooperate, Frank Lucas was choosing to become everything he had once despised. But he did it anyway. Over the next several years, Frank Lucas provided testimony that led to the conviction of more than 100 individuals involved in drug trafficking. He gave prosecutors names, dates, locations, methods. He detailed the corruption that allowed his empire to function, naming police officers who had taken bribes, customs officials who had looked the other way, politicians who had accepted cash in exchange for protection. His cooperation was so extensive, so valuable, that his sentence was reduced from 70 years to 15 years. In 1981, after serving only 5 years, Frank Lucas walked out of prison. He was 50 years old. His mansion was gone, sold to pay legal fees and restitution. His empire was destroyed, dismantled by the very law enforcement agencies he had once evaded. His reputation was in ruins, his name synonymous with betrayal in the criminal world. But he was free. And for a man who had spent his childhood in bondage to sharecropping and his adulthood in bondage to the drug trade, freedom was the only currency that mattered. Frank Lucas tried to live quietly. He moved to a modest home in New Jersey. He avoided the spotlight. He told himself that he was done with the life that had consumed him for decades. But addiction is not limited to substances. The addiction to money, to power, to the adrenaline of living on the edge of catastrophe is just as powerful and infinitely harder to quit. In 1984, Frank Lucas was arrested again, this time for attempting to exchange heroin and cocaine worth $9,000 for 1 kilogram of cocaine. It was a small-time operation, the kind of deal that street-level dealers made every day, a pathetic echo of the empire he had once controlled. He was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He served 5 and was released in 1991. This time, he stayed out. Not because he had found redemption, not because he had undergone some moral transformation, but because he was 60 years old, his body was failing, and the world he had once dominated no longer existed. The drug trade had moved on. New dealers, new drugs, new methods. Frank Lucas was a relic, a name that younger criminals knew only from stories, if they knew it at all. For the next 28 years, Frank Lucas lived in obscurity. He lived in a modest home in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. He survived on Social Security and whatever money he had managed to hide from the government. He gave occasional interviews, telling his story to journalists who were fascinated by the legend of the man who had built a heroin empire by cutting out the Mafia. He embellished some details. He denied others. He cultivated his own mythology, understanding that the story was more valuable than the truth. In 2007, that story reached its apex. Director Ridley Scott released American Gangster, a film starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas and Russell Crowe as Richie Roberts. The film was a Hollywood production, glossy and dramatic, compressing years into hours, inventing dialogue, creating composite characters, and ultimately doing what Hollywood always does. It turned a story about human suffering and systemic failure into entertainment. Denzel Washington played Frank Lucas as a man of contradictions, brutal but honorable, criminal but principled. The film portrayed him as an anti-hero, someone the audience could root for even as they acknowledged the destruction he caused. The real Frank Lucas consulted on the film. He attended the premiere. He watched as Denzel Washington, one of the most respected actors in America, embodied his life on screen. And for a moment, the sharecropper's son from LaGrange was visible again. Not as a criminal, not as an informant, but as a legend. But legends are not real. They are stories we tell to make sense of chaos, to impose narrative structure on lives that are messy and contradictory, and ultimately tragic. The real Frank Lucas was not a hero. He was not even an anti-hero. He was a man who responded to systemic poverty and racial oppression by choosing to inflict suffering on his own community. The heroin he sold destroyed lives. The addicts who bought his blue magic lost their families, their homes, their futures. The children who grew up in homes poisoned by addiction inherited trauma that would ripple through generations. Frank Lucas built his empire on the corpses of the vulnerable, and no amount of Hollywood mythologizing could change that fact. On May 30th, 2019, Frank Lucas died. He was 88 years old. He died of natural causes in Cedar Grove, New Jersey, the same quiet suburb where he had lived in obscurity for nearly 3 decades. There was no grand funeral, no procession through Harlem, no gathering of criminals paying respects to a fallen king. He died the way most people die, quietly, surrounded by family, slipping from consciousness into the void that waits for all of us. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to understand that wealth built on suffering is not wealth at all. It's a debt that compounds across lifetimes. The mansion at 254 Essex Street in Teaneck, New Jersey, was not extraordinary by the standards of American wealth. It was not a Gilded Age palace. It was not a Vanderbilt estate. It was a suburban home, larger than most, well-appointed, set back from the street with a lawn that suggested prosperity without demanding attention. In architectural terms, it was unremarkable. But architecture is not just about design. It is about context. And in the context of Frank Lucas's life, this mansion was everything. Consider the trajectory. A shack in LaGrange, North Carolina, where rain leaked through the roof and cold seeped through gaps in the walls. A series of apartments in Harlem, cramped spaces shared with too many people, where privacy was a luxury no one could afford. And then, suddenly, a house with multiple bedrooms, with space for his children to play, with rooms that served no purpose other than comfort. The mansion was not just a home. It was evidence. It was proof that Frank Lucas had escaped the gravity of poverty that pulls most people back to exactly where they started. But the mansion was also a trap. Because visibility is dangerous in the criminal world, and a house in a white suburb, owned by a black man who had no visible source of legitimate income, was an invitation for scrutiny. Frank Lucas understood this on some level. He tried to maintain a low profile. He told his family to be discreet. He instructed his wife not to wear expensive jewelry in public. He avoided the kind of flashy displays that would attract law enforcement attention. But he could not hide the house itself. The house was a billboard, an advertisement for success, a structure that asked uncomfortable questions of anyone who looked closely enough. Inside the mansion, Frank Lucas tried to create a version of domesticity. He wanted his children to have the childhood he never had. He wanted them to attend good schools, to have opportunities, to believe that the world was a place where hard work led to success. It was a beautiful lie. Because Frank Lucas's children were growing up in a house built on heroin, funded by addiction, sustained by violence. They were living in a palace constructed on a foundation of suffering. and no amount of interior decorating could change that fundamental truth. The rooms of the mansion were filled with expensive furniture, with art that Frank Lucas didn't understand but bought because wealthy people were supposed to appreciate art, with electronics and luxuries that signaled arrival. But there was something hollow about it, something performative. Frank Lucas was not a man who had grown up appreciating the finer things in life. He was a man who had grown up appreciating survival. And now that he had survived, now that he had accumulated wealth beyond his childhood imagination, he didn't quite know what to do with it. So he bought things. He filled rooms. He created a simulacrum of the life he thought wealthy people lived, not understanding that the truly wealthy did not think about their wealth because they had never known its absence. The mansion had a den where Frank Lucas would sometimes sit late at night, smoking cigars, drinking cognac, counting the day's receipts. This was his sanctuary, the one room in the house where he could drop the performance and exist as himself. In this room, surrounded by cash and ledgers and the infrastructure of his empire, Frank Lucas was not playing the role of suburban father. He was the man who had traveled to Southeast Asia and negotiated with warlords. He was the man who had built a distribution network that moved hundreds of kilograms of heroin across state lines. He was the man who understood that the life he was living could not last, that every empire eventually falls, but who believed, with a faith that bordered on delusion, that he would be the exception. The money that filled the mansion, the cash that agents would later find hidden in closets and attics and walls, was not just currency. It was evidence of a mathematical impossibility. Frank Lucas was earning $1 million per day, $7 million per week, more than $300 million per year. In 1970s dollars. Adjust for inflation, and the numbers become staggering. His operation was grossing the equivalent of a modern Fortune 500 company, except it was staffed by criminals, paid no taxes, and produced a product that destroyed everyone who consumed it. But Frank Lucas could not enjoy the wealth. Not really. Because the more money he made, the more paranoid he became. He trusted no one. Not completely. He suspected that his phones were tapped, which they were. He suspected that his associates were informants, which some of them were. He suspected that law enforcement was building a case, which they absolutely were. And he was right to be paranoid. Because in the criminal world, paranoia is not a disorder. It is a survival instinct. The Country Boys, Frank Lucas's network of dealers and enforcers, operated with a discipline that was unusual in the drug trade. Lucas had recruited them specifically from North Carolina, from communities similar to the one he had grown up in, from families that understood poverty and loyalty in equal measure. He paid them well. He treated them with respect. And in return, he demanded absolute obedience. The Country Boys did not use the product they sold. They did not attract attention with flashy cars or expensive jewelry. They moved through their territories like shadows, efficient and deadly, creating a distribution network that operated with the precision of a legitimate business. But even the most disciplined organization has vulnerabilities. And Frank Lucas's vulnerability was his own ego. He wanted to be more than just a successful criminal. He wanted to be a legend. He wanted people to know his name, to recognize his face, to understand that the boy from LaGrange had conquered New York City. And so he made mistakes. He attended the Ali Frazier fight in a chinchilla coat. He allowed himself to be photographed with celebrities. He lived in a mansion in a white suburb where his presence was an anomaly. And each of these choices, individually small, collectively created a portrait that law enforcement could not ignore. Detective Richie Roberts was not the first law enforcement officer to notice Frank Lucas, but he was the first to understand what he was seeing. Roberts recognized that Lucas represented something new, a shift in the power dynamics of the drug trade. For decades, the Italian Mafia had controlled heroin distribution in New York City. They had partnerships with suppliers in Europe and Asia. They had relationships with corrupt officials. They had an infrastructure that was difficult to penetrate. But Frank Lucas had done what everyone said was impossible. He had bypassed the Mafia entirely. Roberts began building his case slowly. He could not rely on traditional methods. Frank Lucas did not keep records in banks. He did not use credit cards. He did not leave a paper trail that investigators could follow. So Roberts did what detectives have done since the beginning of law enforcement. He watched. He waited. He gathered evidence piece by piece, photograph by photograph, until the portrait of Frank Lucas's empire became undeniable. The surveillance was extensive. Agents followed Lucas as he moved through Harlem, as he met with associates, as he collected payments and distributed product. They photographed his mansion. They documented his cars. They identified the members of his organization, creating a map of relationships that connected dozens of individuals across multiple states. And slowly, methodically, they built a case that would survive the scrutiny of a federal trial. But surveillance alone was not enough. Roberts needed informants. He needed someone inside Lucas's organization who would be willing to testify, to explain how the operation worked, to provide details that could only come from direct experience. And in the criminal world, creating informants requires leverage. It requires finding someone who has been arrested, who is facing significant prison time, who values their freedom more than their loyalty. Roberts and his team worked their way up the chain, flipping low-level dealers, using their testimony to arrest mid-level managers, using those arrests to pressure higher-ranking members of the organization. Frank Lucas felt the walls closing in. He increased security around his home. He changed his phone numbers. He altered his routines. But he did not stop. He could not stop. Because stopping would mean admitting that the empire he had built was unsustainable, that the life he had created for his family was a mirage, that everything he had achieved could be taken away in a single morning. And Frank Lucas was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. On the morning of January 28, 1975, when federal agents broke through the door of 254 Essex Street, Frank Lucas was not surprised. He had known this moment was coming. He had prepared for it in the abstract, the way people prepare for their own mortality, with a vague understanding that it is inevitable, but without any real acceptance of its imminence. He did not resist arrest. He did not attempt to flee. He stood in the entryway of his mansion, watched agents move through his home, and understood that this chapter of his life was ending. The $584,000 that agents found in the mansion was only a fraction of Frank Lucas's wealth. The rest was hidden in locations across the city, in safe deposit boxes registered under false names, in the homes of associates who were trusted to safeguard cash, in investments that were deliberately obscure. But the government would never recover most of it. Some of it was seized during subsequent raids. Some of it was stolen by associates who understood that Frank Lucas was no longer in a position to enforce loyalty. And some of it simply disappeared, absorbed into the criminal ecosystem that had created it. The mansion itself became evidence. Prosecutors used photographs of the house during the trial, presenting them to the jury as proof of the wealth that Frank Lucas had accumulated through illegal means. They pointed to the expensive furniture, the luxury cars in the garage, the swimming pool in the backyard. They argued that no legitimate business could generate this level of wealth, and that the only explanation for Frank Lucas's prosperity was a criminal enterprise of staggering scale. The jury agreed. After Frank Lucas's conviction, the mansion was seized by the federal government under asset forfeiture laws. The government sold it at auction, using the proceeds to offset the costs of the investigation and prosecution. The family that bought the house had no connection to Frank Lucas. They were not criminals. They were not interested in the house's history. They simply wanted a home in a good neighborhood with good schools. And so the mansion, which had been the physical manifestation of Frank Lucas's empire, became an ordinary suburban house again. The walls that had once hidden cash now hid children's toys. The rooms that had witnessed criminal conspiracies now witnessed homework and birthday parties. The architecture remained the same, but the meaning had changed completely. Frank Lucas's time in prison was difficult in ways that extended beyond the physical confinement. He was no longer a king. He was an inmate, subject to the same rules and indignities as every other prisoner. But worse than the loss of freedom was the loss of respect. When word spread that he had become an informant, that he had testified against former associates, that he had provided evidence that sent dozens of people to prison, Frank Lucas became a pariah. In the criminal world, there is a hierarchy of sins, and betrayal ranks above all others. A man who kills can be respected. A man who steals can be understood. But a man who informs is beyond redemption. The irony was not lost on Frank Lucas. He had spent decades building an empire on loyalty, recruiting men he could trust, creating a network held together by shared background and mutual interest. And then, when the government offered him a choice between 70 years in prison and cooperation, he had chosen himself. He had prioritized his own survival over the code that had governed his life. And in doing so, he had become exactly what Bumpy Johnson would have despised. But Frank Lucas rationalized the decision. He told himself that the criminal world had betrayed him first, that the associates he had enriched had been too careless, that the organization had been compromised by weakness, that his cooperation was simply a pragmatic response to circumstances beyond his control. He told himself these things, and perhaps he even believed them. But belief is not the same as truth. When Frank Lucas was released from prison in 1981, after serving only 5 years of his original sentence, he returned to a world that had moved on without him. The heroin trade was still thriving, but under new management. The Italian Mafia, weakened by federal prosecutions, had been replaced by Caribbean and Latin American cartels that operated with different methods and different ethics. Harlem itself was changing. The community devastated by decades of addiction, beginning the long, slow process of recovery that would take generations. Frank Lucas had no place in this new landscape. He was a ghost, a name from the past, a cautionary tale told by older criminals to younger ones about the dangers of hubris. He tried to live quietly. He tried to be invisible. But in 1984, he was arrested again. The details of the arrest are almost sad in their banality. He was caught attempting to facilitate a small drug transaction, the kind of deal that would have been beneath his notice at the height of his power. It was not about the money. It was about the addiction to the life, to the adrenaline, to the identity that he had constructed over decades. Frank Lucas did not know how to be anyone other than a criminal. And so, even knowing the consequences, even having spent years in prison, he returned to the only life he understood. His second conviction and imprisonment broke something in him. When he was released in 1991, he was 60 years old. His health was declining. His reputation was destroyed. The mansion was long gone. The empire was a memory. And Frank Lucas faced a question that most people never have to confront. Who am I when I am not the person I have been? He spent the next 28 years searching for an answer. He lived in Cedar Grove, New Jersey, in a modest home that bore no resemblance to the mansion he had once owned. He collected Social Security. He gave interviews occasionally, telling his story to journalists and filmmakers who were fascinated by the legend. He became a consultant on the film American Gangster, watching as Denzel Washington transformed his life into entertainment, and he tried, in his own way, to come to terms with the damage he had caused. But redemption is not a narrative arc. It is not something that happens simply because time passes. Frank Lucas never expressed genuine remorse for the lives destroyed by his heroin. He never acknowledged the full scope of the suffering he had caused. In interviews, he would sometimes admit that he had made mistakes, that he regretted certain decisions, that if he could do it over, he would choose differently. But these admissions always felt performative, as if he were saying what he thought people wanted to hear, rather than expressing genuine understanding of his moral culpability. The truth is that Frank Lucas was a product of a system that offered him no legitimate path to prosperity. He was born into poverty that was not accidental but designed, created by laws and policies that deliberately excluded Black Americans from economic opportunity. He witnessed racial violence that went unpunished. He grew up understanding that the American dream was not available to him through legal means. And so he chose illegal means. His choice was his own, and he bore responsibility for it. But the context matters. The system that created Frank Lucas shares responsibility for the destruction he caused. If this story made you think, leave a comment below. What does it cost to build an empire on suffering? Hit the like button if you believe that true wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the lives we impact. When Frank Lucas died on May 30th, 2019, the obituaries focused on his notoriety. They recounted the details of his heroin empire, his conviction, his portrayal in American Gangster. They treated his life as a curiosity, a piece of American criminal history that was interesting in the way that all stories about outlaws are interesting. But they largely ignored the human cost. They did not interview the families destroyed by blue magic. They did not calculate the number of overdose deaths that could be attributed to his product. They did not examine the generational trauma inflicted on communities that were already marginalized and vulnerable. The mansion at 254 Essex Street still stands. It has changed hands several times since the government seized it in 1976. The current owners have renovated it, updating the kitchen, remodeling the bathrooms, erasing the physical traces of Frank Lucas's occupation. The house has no historical marker. There is no plaque identifying it as the former home of one of America's most notorious drug dealers. It is simply a house, occupied by people living ordinary lives, unaware or unconcerned with the history embedded in the walls around them. But history does not disappear simply because we stop talking about it. The mansion is still the mansion, regardless of who owns it. The rooms where Frank Lucas counted his millions, where he planned his operations, where he tried to create a normal life for his family despite the criminal empire that funded it, those rooms still exist. The architecture remembers, even if the people do not. In Harlem, the legacy of Frank Lucas is more complicated. Some remember him as a legend, a man who beat the system, who showed that Black entrepreneurs could compete with and surpass the Italian Mafia. Others remember him as a predator, someone who exploited the vulnerability of his own community for personal gain, who sold poison to people who were already suffering, who built his wealth on the corpses of the addicted. Both perspectives contain truth. Frank Lucas was both things simultaneously. He was a symbol of resistance against a racist system and a perpetrator of immense harm. He was a man who escaped poverty and a man who kept others trapped in it. The heroin trade that Frank Lucas helped expand did not end with his arrest. It evolved. New dealers replaced him. New products replaced blue magic. The demand for escape, for relief from the grinding reality of poverty and racism and hopelessness, did not disappear. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation, each one producing its own Frank Lucases, its own men who looked at the limited options available to them and chose crime. This is the systemic failure that Frank Lucas's story exposes. The war on drugs, launched by President Nixon in 1971, treated addiction as a criminal problem rather than a public health crisis. It invested billions of dollars in law enforcement and incarceration while providing minimal funding for treatment and prevention. It disproportionately targeted Black and Latino communities, incarcerating millions of people for drug offenses while doing little to address the underlying conditions that made drug dealing economically rational. Frank Lucas was a product of this system, and when he was removed, the system simply produced someone new to take his place. The film American Gangster, for all its entertainment value, perpetuated a dangerous mythology. It portrayed Frank Lucas as a man of principle, someone who had a code, who cared about his community even as he poisoned it. Denzel Washington's performance was magnetic, making Lucas sympathetic, even admirable. The film suggested that Lucas was somehow better than the Italian Mafia he replaced, that his operation was cleaner, more efficient, more honorable. But this was fiction. Frank Lucas was not honorable. He was ruthless. He was pragmatic. And he caused suffering on a scale that the film barely acknowledged. The real Frank Lucas, watching the film at its premiere, must have experienced a strange cognitive dissonance. On screen, he was played by one of America's most respected actors, his story told with Hollywood production values, his life transformed into myth. But sitting in the theater, he was an 80-year-old man living on Social Security, his empire destroyed, his reputation in ruins, his body failing. The contrast between the legend and the reality must have been jarring, but perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who we actually are is the space where all human tragedy occurs. In the end, the mansion does not matter. The money does not matter. The empire does not matter. What matters is the human cost, the lives destroyed, the families broken, the communities devastated. Frank Lucas built his wealth by exploiting the most vulnerable people in society. He took people who were already suffering and made their suffering worse. And he did so not because he had to, but because it was profitable. This is his legacy. Not the mansion, not the movie, but the suffering. The story of Frank Lucas is not a story about the American dream. It is a story about the American nightmare, about what happens when a society creates conditions of such profound inequality that crime becomes rational, when the distance between poverty and prosperity is so vast that people are willing to do anything to cross it, when the legitimate economy offers no path forward and the illegitimate economy offers millions. Frank Lucas crossed that distance. He escaped poverty. He built an empire. And in doing so, he revealed the fundamental brutality of a system that creates such extreme disparities in the first place. If you made it this far, take a moment to reflect. Share this story with someone who needs to understand that every empire has a cost, and the bill always comes due. The algorithm rewards engagement, but truth rewards patience. On May 30th, 2019, Frank Lucas died in his sleep. He was 88 years old. His funeral was private, attended by family members and a few friends. There were no crowds lining the streets. There was no procession through Harlem. The king had died decades earlier. What remained was just a man, old and sick and forgotten, slipping quietly into whatever comes next, The mansion at 254 Essex Street remains, occupied by people who have no connection to its history. The walls do not speak. The rooms do not remember. The architecture is neutral, serving whatever purpose its current inhabitants assign to it. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of Frank Lucas's story. Buildings outlast the people who build them. Stone and timber and glass persist long after the humans who gave them meaning have turned to dust. The mansion is still there. But Frank Lucas is gone. The empire is gone. The money is gone. What remains is only the story, passed down through generations, a cautionary tale about ambition and hubris and the price of building wealth on the suffering of others. And somewhere, in cities across America, a new generation is making the same calculations that Frank Lucas made decades ago. They are looking at poverty and seeing no escape. They are looking at the drug trade and seeing opportunity. They are telling themselves that they will be smarter, more careful, that they will avoid the mistakes that destroyed their predecessors. They are wrong. The cycle continues. The empire rises and falls. The mansion is built and seized. And the human cost, invisible to those who profit from it, compounds across generations. This is the story of Frank Lucas. Not a hero. Not an anti-hero. Just a man who responded to systemic failure with a choice that caused immense harm. His mansion is empty of his presence now. His empire is scattered to history. But the damage remains, woven into the fabric of communities that are still recovering, still healing, still trying to build something better from the ruins he left behind. The walls absorbed the laughter of his children, the clink of glasses at dinner parties, the sound of money being counted late at night. And they absorbed, too, the silent screams of those who overdosed on blue magic, whose suffering funded every luxury, whose deaths were the unacknowledged foundation of his empire. The mansion stands as testimony to both, a palace built on powder, a dream constructed from nightmares, a monument to the terrible cost of surviving in a world that offers some people no legitimate path to prosperity. Frank Lucas is gone now. The home is gone in every meaningful sense, even if the structure remains. But the question lingers, waiting for those who dare to ask it. What is the true cost of empire? And who pays it? The answer, written in the empty rooms and fading memories, is clear. Everyone pays. The criminal and the victim, the wealthy and the poor, the living and the dead. Everyone pays. And the debt never stops compounding, generation after generation, until someone finally has the courage to refuse the bargain altogether.